Silas Thorne dragged the pine box through the alkali dust of the salt flats. The sound, a rhythmic, dry scream against the parched earth. The rope bit into his shoulder, a frayed serpent of hemp that had already worn through his flannel shirt to the raw, salt-stung skin beneath. Behind him, the box left a shallow trench in the white crust of the basin, a scar that the wind was already trying to heal with fine, biting grit. Ahead, the silhouette of a lonely, leaning shack stood against the shimmering horizon, its wood bleached the color of bone. Silas stopped, his breath coming in jagged hitches that tasted of copper and dry sage. He wiped a hand across his brow, leaving a smear of red-brown mud where sweat met the relentless dust. He looked at the sun, a white-hot hole in the sky that seemed to be burning the blue out of the atmosphere. It didn't care about the dead, and it cared even less for the living who was stubborn enough to keep moving. He looked back at the box, the lid nailed shut with a finality that made his stomach churn. He kicked the wood, a dull thud echoing across the flats, and then resumed the haul. The shack was closer now, and he could see a figure sitting in a rocker on the porch. The rocking was steady, a slow creak thump that cut through the whistling wind like a metronome in a fever dream. Silas reached the edge of the hard-packed dirt that served as a yard and let the rope go. The box settled into the dust with a heavy, hollow sigh. He stood there, chest heaving, his hands trembling as he reached for the canteen at his hip. He shook it. It was empty, the dry rattle of a few drops against metal a mockery of his thirst. The man in the rocker didn't stop moving. He was thin, his skin like yellowed parchment stretched over a frame of old hickory. A shotgun lay across his lap, his gnarled fingers resting near the triggers with a casual, terrifying familiarity. "You're late, Silas," the man said, his voice a low rasp like stones grinding together at the bottom of a well. Silas spat into the dust, the liquid disappearing instantly. "The flats don't favor a heavy load, Miller. I got here." Miller stopped rocking, the silence that followed more oppressive than the heat. "And the guest of honor? Did he give you any trouble on the way?" Silas looked at the pine box, then back at Miller. "He's quiet, quiet as a man can be." Miller leaned forward, the porch boards groaning under the shifting weight. "He's alive in there, isn't he? I can hear the wood scratching from here." Silas felt a cold spike of dread in his marrow, a sensation that shouldn't be possible in the 100-degree heat. "He's as dead as the law says he is, Miller. That's why I'm here, to put him where he belongs." Miller stood up, the shotgun held loosely in one hand. "Well, don't just stand there airing out your sins. Start digging. The sun won't wait for your conscience." Silas walked to the side of the shack, where a rusted spade was leaning against the water barrel. The barrel was bone dry, the staves beginning to pull apart in the heat. He picked up the spade, the handle rough and splintered, and walked to a patch of ground Miller had marked with a circle of white stones. The earth here was hard as iron, baked by decades of unforgiving sun. He drove the spade into the dirt, the vibration traveling up his arms and rattling his teeth. He dug with a frantic, desperate energy, each strike of the blade a strike against his own memory. Miller watched from the porch, lighting a thin, hand-rolled cigarette that smelled of sulfur and cheap tobacco. The smoke drifted toward Silas, a gray ghost in the still air. "Why him, Silas?" Miller asked after a long silence. "Of all the men you've crossed, why bury this one while he's still breathing?" Silas didn't look up, his spade hitting the rock with a sharp metallic clink. Because he knows things that can't be unsaid, and the ground is the only place that keeps a secret. Miller chuckled, a dry hacking sound. The ground is a gossip, boy. It'll spit him back up first time the rains come. The wind picked up, swirling a funnel of dust around the gravesite. Silas squinted, his eyes stinging, and saw a rider approaching from the north. The horse was a dark bay, his coat matted with sweat and alkali. The rider was a woman, her face hidden behind a wide-brimmed hat and a bandana pulled high over her nose. Miller raised the shotgun, the hammer clicking back with a sound like a bone snapping. "Company, Silas. I didn't know you invited the ladies to the funeral." The rider pulled up 10 yards away, the horse blowing and shaking his head. She pulled the bandana down, revealing a face that was youthful but etched with a deep, weary anger. "Put the gun down, Miller," her voice steady, despite the tremor in her horse's legs. "I'm not here for you. I'm here for what's in the box." Silas stopped digging, leaning on the spade. "Sarah, you shouldn't have followed me. There's nothing for you here but dust." Sarah dismounted, her boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. She walked toward the pine box, her hand resting on the grip of the revolver at her waist. "My father's in there, Silas. I know he is. I saw you haul him out of the cellar in the middle of the night." Silas stepped out of the shallow hole, his face a mask of grime and regret. "He's not your father anymore, Sarah. He's a witness, and witnesses don't live long in this territory." Miller stood up, the shotgun held loosely in one hand. "The girl's got spirit, Silas. Maybe we should put her in the hole with him, save us a trip later." Silas moved instinctively, stepping between Miller and Sarah. "Touch her, Miller, and I'll bury you in the box instead. I mean it." The tension in the yard was a physical weight, a taut wire stretched to the breaking point. Sarah looked at the box, her eyes filling with tears that she refused to let fall. She took a step toward it, her hand resting on the grip of the revolver at her waist. She almost touched the lid, her hand hovering inches away, but the box suddenly lurched. A muffled, rhythmic thumping came from inside the pine. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of a hist hitting wood, a desperate, frantic plea for air. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "He's alive, Silas. Let him out, please." Miller laughed again, the sound more jagged than before. "He's a lively one, isn't he? Must be the fear. It keeps the heart pumping long after the soul is quit." He nudged the box with the toe of his boot. "Hear that, old man? Your daughter's here to watch you go under. Hope you said your prayers." Silas grabbed the spade, his knuckles white. "Miller, shut up. Sarah, go back to the horse, now." She didn't move. She turned to Silas, her eyes searching his for a spark of the man she used to know. "You can't do this, Silas. You're not a murderer. You're just a coward." The word hit him harder than a bullet. He looked at the box, the thumping growing weaker, more irregular. He remembered the night in the cellar, the way the old man had looked at him, not with anger, but with a terrible, knowing pity. He remembered the way the lantern light had caught the silver of the old man's hair as he bound his hands. Silas almost reached for the hammer in his belt to pry the nails loose. He almost spoke the truth, that he was doing this to save the old man from the Vane brothers, who would do much worse than a quick burial. But Miller was watching, and Miller was the Vane's eyes in the wash. "The hole ain't deep enough, Silas," Miller said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Stop playing with the girl and get back to work, or I'll start shooting until the screaming stops." Sarah pulled her revolver, the movement fast and practiced. She didn't point it at Miller. She pointed it at Silas. "Give me the hammer, Silas. Move away from the box." Silas didn't move. "Sarah, you don't understand. If I open that box, we all die. The veins are less than 5 miles behind you." New information. The power shifted. Sarah's eyes widened, her gaze darting to the northern ridge. I didn't see anyone." "Because they don't want to be seen," Silas said, stepping toward her. "They let you follow me. They used you to find Miller's place. They want the old man, and they want the gold he hid." Miller's eyes narrowed, the shotgun dipping slightly. "Gold? You didn't say nothing about no gold, Silas." Silas turned on Miller, his voice like iron. "Because you're drunk and a loudmouth, Miller. The Vanes know you're holding the old man for them. They're coming to collect, and they aren't going to leave any witnesses behind, including you." Miller's face paled, the yellowed skin turning a sickly shade of gray. "You're lying. They said I'd get a cut, a big one." A distant sound echoed through the wash, the sharp, unmistakable crack of a rifle shot. A geyser of dust erupted 3 feet from Miller's boots. The Vanes had arrived. The calm was shattered, the tension exploding into a chaotic, desperate scramble for cover. "Into the shack!" Silas screamed, grabbing Sarah by the arm and diving toward the porch. Miller didn't move fast enough. A second shot rang out, and Miller's shoulder disintegrated in a spray of red and bone. He fell backward, the shotgun firing blindly into the air as he hit the dirt. Silas dragged Sarah through the door, the wood splintering as a hail of lead slammed into the siding. Inside, the shack was a single room filled with the smell of wood rot and old grease. A heavy oak table sat in the center. Silas flipped it over, pinning Sarah behind it. "Stay down. Don't move unless I tell you." He crawled to the window, peering over the sill. 4 riders were circling the yard, their silhouettes blurred by the rising dust storm. They were dressed in long black dusters, their faces covered by hoods. The Vane brothers. They didn't ride like men, they rode like demons. One of the riders stopped near the pine box, his horse rearing and pawing at the wood. He held a torch, the orange flame licking at the dry air. "Thorne," the rider bellowed, his voice carrying over the wind, "send the old man out or we burn the shack with you in it." Sarah gripped Silas's sleeve, her fingers digging into his arm. "We have to do something. They'll kill him. They'll burn the box." Silas looked at his revolver, then at the 2 spare cylinders in his pocket. 10 rounds against 4 rifles and a torch. The odds were a death sentence. "Listen to me," Silas whispered, his face inches from hers. "I'm going out there. When I start shooting, you run for your horse. Don't look back." She shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "No, I won't leave him. I won't leave you." He almost kissed her then, a desperate final touch in the face of the end, but a bullet shattered the window frame above his head, raining glass down on his shoulders. Silas stood up, his jaw set in a grim line. "I'm the one who put him in that box, Sarah. I'm the only one who can get him out." He didn't wait for her to argue. He kicked the door open and stepped onto the porch, his peacemaker barking twice. The rider with the torch spun out of his saddle, the flame tumbling into the dust. The other 3 riders returned fire instantly. Silas dove off the porch, rolling into the shallow grave he'd spent the morning digging. The hard earth offered a meager sanctuary. He popped up, firing 2 more rounds, seeing one of the horses bolt as a bullet grazed its flank. "Burn 'em!" one of the Vanes shouted. Another rider leaned down, picking up the fallen torch. He spurred his horse toward the pine box, the flame roaring in the wind. Silas aimed, his breath held tight, his fingers squeezing the trigger. Click, a misfire.
He frantically thumbed the hammer for the next round, but he was too slow. The rider tossed the torch. It landed squarely on the lid of the pine box. The dry wood, parched by the sun in the long hall, ignited instantly. A scream erupted from inside the box, a high, thin wail of pure agony that cut through the roar of the gunfight. "No!" Sarah shrieked from the shack. She ran out onto the porch, her revolver spitting lead at the riders. She hit one in the thigh, but she was a stationary target. A Vane brother leveled his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. Silas saw the movement and lunged out of the grave. He didn't shoot the rider. He tackled Sarah, the two of them crashing back through the doorway of the shack just as a rifle ball tore through the air where her head had been. Outside, the box was a pillar of orange and black smoke. The screaming from inside had stopped, replaced by the crackling of wood and the whistling of the wind. The old man was gone. Silas felt a hollow, cold weight settle in his chest. He had tried to save the man by burying him, and instead he had built his funeral pyre. He looked at Sarah. She was staring at the doorway, her face pale, her eyes vacant. The realization of what had happened hit her like a physical blow. She slumped against the wall, the revolver slipping from her hand. "They killed him! You killed him!" Silas didn't have an answer. He looked out the window. The Vanes were dismounting now, confident. They had lost one man, but they had the shack surrounded. They didn't care about the old man anymore. They wanted revenge for their brother. "Come out, Thorn. We'll make it quick for the girl if you come out now. Otherwise, we take our time." Silas looked at the back wall of the shack. The wood was old, rotted by the occasional leak. He kicked a board, and it gave way, revealing the shimmering heat of the flats behind the house. "Sarah, look at me," he commanded, grabbing her shoulders. She didn't respond. He shook her, harder this time. "Look at me. We can still get out. There's a back way. Go to the rocks. Wait for me there." She looked at him then, and the hatred in her eyes was a searing physical heat. "I hope they kill you, Silas. I hope they take a week to do it." She scrambled through the hole in the wall, disappearing into the dust and the heat. Silas was alone. He looked at his gun. 2 rounds left. He stood up, walking toward the front door. He wasn't going to hide. He wasn't going to run. He had lived his whole life as a man who buried his problems. It was time to stand on top of them. He stepped onto the porch, his arms held wide. The 3 remaining Vane brothers stood in a semicircle, their rifles aimed at his heart. The lead brother, a man with a jagged scar across his nose, stepped forward. "Where's the girl, Thorn?" Silas smiled, a bloody, crooked thing. "She's gone, and she's got the map." Lies, the final currency of a dying man. The brothers looked at each other, greed flickering in their eyes. "You're bluffing," the leader said, but his aim wavered. "Search the shack if you want," Silas said, stepping off the porch, "but she's halfway to the canyon by now. You want the gold, you better start riding." One of the brothers turned toward his horse. "He's lying. Shoot him and get the girl." In that moment of hesitation, Silas drew his peacemaker. He fired his last 2 rounds with the speed of a lightning strike. The leader took a bullet to the throat, his rifle firing into the dirt as he collapsed. The other 2 brothers fired simultaneously. Silas felt a heavy, dull impact in his chest, then another in his thigh. The world tilted, the white salt of the flats rushing up to meet him. He hit the ground hard, the air driven from his lungs. He lay there, watching the sky, the white-hot sun beginning to dim at the edges. He heard the remaining Vanes mounting up, their shouts fading as they spurred their horses toward the north, chasing a ghost and a girl that wasn't there. The yard went quiet, except for the crackling of the burnt pine box. The smell of charcoal and burnt sugar filled the air. Silas tried to breathe, but his lungs felt like they were filled with hot sand. He turned his head, looking at the remains of the box. The wood had collapsed into a pile of gray ash and blackened ribs. But there, in the center of the ruin, something glinted. It wasn't gold, it was a piece of metal, a small circular disc, a locket. Silas reached out, his fingers trembling, his vision blurring. He almost touched it, his hand inches from the scorched silver, but his strength failed, his hand dropping into the dust. The twist. The man in the box hadn't been Sarah's father. The man in the box had been the real Silas Thorne. The man dying in the dust was an imposter, a drifter who had stolen a name and a life to hide from a past that finally caught up with him. He had spent 6 years trying to bury the man he had murdered, and in the end, the name had buried him. Silas, or the man who had been Silas, let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked at the horizon, where the dust storm was finally beginning to settle. The sun was a deep, bloody red, casting long, skeletal shadows across the wash. He saw a figure standing at the edge of the hard-packed dirt. It was Sarah. She walked toward him, her footsteps silent in the soft dust. She stood over him, her shadow falling on his face like a shroud. She didn't have a gun in her hand. She had the ledger. She had taken it from the box before the fire started. She knew Silas would go out to face the veins. She used his guilt as a shield. "You were a good Thorn," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Better than the real one. He was a coward. You were just a fool." She looked at the locket near his hand and kicked it away into the dirt.
"There's no room for sentiment in the wash, Arthur. That was your first mistake." She turned and walked toward her horse, her movements efficient and cold. She mounted up and rode south, the dark bay a vanishing point against the twilight. She didn't look back. The man who was not Silas Thorne watched her go, the darkness finally closing in around the edges of his vision. He felt the cold of the desert night beginning to seep into his bones. He was a man who had arrived to bury someone who wasn't dead, and he succeeded. He had buried Arthur Miller. The ground was a gossip, but it was also a prison. He lay in the yard of the leaning shack, his blood soaking into the thirsty earth. The shack groaned in the wind, the porch boards creaking with a slow, rhythmic creak thump. The sun disappeared completely, leaving the world to the stars and the silence. The vultures circled high above, patient and certain. The wind carried the smell of sage and the faint, lingering scent of burnt pine. It was a quiet ending, heavy with the weight of things left unsaid and crimes left unpunished. The salt flats remained, white and indifferent, waiting for the next man to come hauling his box of secrets. In the morning, the heat would return, and the dust would cover the remains of the box and the body in the dirt. The wash would forget the name of Silas Thorne, and it would never know the name of Arthur Miller. The only thing that would remain was the trench in the alkali, a shallow scar that the wind would eventually heal, a story written in the sand, erased by the very air that carried it. Silas felt a final sharp pang of regret, not for the life he'd stolen, but for the man he might have been if he'd never found that pine box. He almost spoke a name from a life so far away it felt like a dream, but the name died in his throat, a final secret kept by the dying. The darkness took him then, a heavy velvet curtain falling over the stage. The rocker on the porch continued to move, creak, thump, until the wind finally died down and the night was absolute. The ledger Sarah carried would bring her a fortune or a rope. The Vane brothers would ride until their horses dropped, chasing a ghost that had already vanished, and the real Silas Thorne, wherever his bones actually lay, was finally, truly alone. The West didn't offer redemption, only consequences, and the consequence of being a man who buries the living is that you eventually become the ghost in the machine. The silence of the wash was broken only by the occasional crack of a cooling rock. The heat of the day was a memory, the chill of the night a promise of the void. The grave Silas had dug remained empty, a hollow mouth waiting for a meal that would never come. He lay beside it, his face turned toward the stars, his eyes open but seeing nothing. A man who had tried to bury the truth, only to find that the truth is the only thing the earth refuses to swallow. The moon rose, casting a silver light over the yard, making the alkali glow like frost. The burnt remains of the pine box looked like the rib cage of a leviathan, a skeleton of a lie that had finally collapsed. The locket lay a few feet away, the silver tarnished by the fire, the face inside hidden forever by the grime. It was a quiet, haunting scene, a visual testament to the futility of running from yourself in a land that has no shadows during the day and too many at night. The story of Arthur Miller was a footnote in a territory of epics, a man who arrived with a box and left with a bullet. He had sought a fresh start in a place that only knew how to rot. He had tried to be a protector, but he was only ever a participant in the slaughter. The desert didn't care. The desert just was. As the hours passed, the coyotes began to howl from the ridges, their voices thin and mournful. They were the only ones left to sing for the dead. The wind whispered through the sage, carrying the ashes of the pine box across the flats, scattering the old man's secrets to the four corners of the world. The light of the stars flickered, cold and distant, offering no comfort and no guidance. The night was long, the silence was deep, and the end was permanent. In the distance, the silhouette of the shack seemed to lean even further, a tired old thing waiting to fall. It had seen many men come with boxes and many go without them. It was a repository of failures, a monument to the desperate. And as the first hint of gray began to touch the eastern horizon, the world felt older, heavier, and more fragile than it had the day before. The salt flats were a blank page, ready for the next set of tracks, the next set of lies, and the next empty grave. The cycle would continue, as it always did, greed, blood, and the scorching sun. The names would change, but the stories would remain the same. A man with a spade, a girl with a gun, and a box that held more than just a body. The West was a hungry beast, and it was never full. It took the living, and it took the dead, and it turned them both into the same white dust that coated the boots of every traveler. Arthur Miller's eyes finally clouded over, the reflection of the stars fading from the pupils. His skin turned cold, the heat of the struggle finally leaving him. He was no longer a marshal, no longer an imposter, no longer a man. He was just part of the wash, a piece of the landscape, a landmark for the vultures. The haunting weight of his choices remained, a lingering pressure in the air that seemed to make the very wind feel heavy. The sun broke over the horizon, a golden blade that cut through the darkness. It hit the salt flats with a blinding intensity, turning the white crust into a sea of fire. It found the body in the yard, the burnt wood and the empty grave. It didn't blink. It didn't pause. It began its daily work of bleaching the world, turning everything back to bone and ash. The story was over. The silence was absolute, and the desert was home. The locket glinted one last time as the light hit it, a tiny spark of silver in a world of white. Then the wind blew a layer of grit over it, hiding the metal from view. A few more gusts and it would be gone. A few more years and the shack would be a pile of splinters. A few more centuries and the wash would be nothing but a memory of an ancient sea. Time was the only thing that won in the end, and time was a silent, patient hunter. The girl Sarah was already 20 miles away, her face set toward the mountains. She had the ledger, she had the horse, and she had the future. She didn't feel guilty. She didn't feel sad. She only felt the weight of the silver star she'd taken from Arthur's pocket while he lay dying. It was a heavy thing, a badge of authority in a land of chaos. She pinned it to her shirt, the metal cold against her skin, a new marshal for a new day, and the cycle began again. The desert breathed out, a long, hot sigh that carried the scent of alkali and spent powder. The heat of the day began to push, a heavy, invisible hand pressing down on the scorched earth. The grave sat waiting, its mouth open, its stomach empty. The body beside it didn't move. The box was a ghost, and the silence was the only truth left in the Blackwater Wash. The sound of the rocker on the porch had stopped. The wind was the only thing left to move the wood. It creaked once, a final lonely note, and then was still. The world was bright, the sky was empty, and the story was finished. No happy endings, no clean resolutions, only the haunting weight of the choices made in the shadow of the sun. And the desert, always the desert, holding its secrets tight until the stars themselves go out. The last of the smoke from the pine box vanished into the blue. The ash was scattered. The blood was dry.
A man who arrived to bury someone who wasn't dead was finally irrevocably buried by his own hand. The salt flats shimmered in the heat, a vast white mirror reflecting nothing but the void. It was a quiet, heavy, and emotionally haunting end to a journey that never really had a chance. And as the sun climbed higher, the world began to burn all over again. The locket was completely covered now. The spade was buried by a fallen board from the porch. The tracks of the bay horse were gone. The wash was a blank slate once more. The secrets were safe. The silence was absolute.